Thank you for being here. The chat today is called EBITDA Unlocked. So we're going to be talking about how smart pricing can make your vacation rental business worth more. So we're going to start with a little intro of Angelos, just telling you why we're here talking about EBITDA and enterprise value. Then we're going to talk about why and how smart operators care on enterprise value, and we're going to define enterprise value as a concept. From there, we're going to talk about how you guys can increase enterprise value as property management operators. We're going to then wrap it up with some portfolio KPIs that you can all use to level out as a property management company. We'll try to make this as practical, hopefully valuable as possible. So just quickly on Angelos, we are a company that helps property management operators increase their bookings and profits by combining revenue management with listing optimization. And we work with 2,000 listings across 60 cities, basically helping operators with their revenue management and listing optimization so they can make more bookings and earn more. Now, most operators grow inventory, smart operators grow enterprise value. So who here recognizes this little logo here? I'm sure all of you do. And as all of you know, this happened recently. And the reason I start with this is because, it's no surprise for anyone here that there's a lot of consolidation happening in this industry. And, that comes from the fact that there's a lot of small, mid-sized operators, and, anytime there's such level of fragmentation, it just happens that, there's appetite for, M&A to happen, whether that's strategic acquisitions from larger operators, whether that's private equity wanting to get into the sector. But the reason I talk about this specific transaction here is because I think there's a few things we can all learn from what happened. And I was actually chatting this morning with Steve from Casago, and so the things I'll be sharing have been approved to some degree by him. And I think there's a few lessons. Lesson number one is growing at all costs and adding units at all costs does not add enterprise value. So having more units just for the sake of having more units doesn't make your business worth more. What matters is profitability per unit, much more than volume of units. The second thing is you need to know how much you can afford to pay to acquire an owner, right? And so another mistake that happened here is they went on a buying streak and they just started paying whatever just to grow the inventory number, not necessarily understanding the numbers that we're going to get into later today in terms of how you should determine how much you should be willing to spend in order to acquire an owner in your management portfolio. And then the other thing here is, when it comes to the fundamentals, right? You gotta keep in mind that, Casago has been around, and Steve started this 25 years ago, right? So great things that can happen in this industry and any industry really, but it takes time and you gotta set up the right foundations. We cannot, cut any corners here just to grow at all seconds. And the last one, I think it's really important to keep in mind that there's a lot of vendors here, there's a lot of technology companies, there's a lot of talks about AI. But I think another mistake here that we saw Vacasa make is that when they went public, they were worth $4 billion. And in a big part of why they justified the valuation to the market is because they were calling themselves a technology company. Whereas in reality, the market and maybe themselves also realized later on that they were not a technology company, they were a service company. Right? And talking with Steve this morning, he said it himself as well. He said Vacasa had it backwards. They saw value in the technology and saw the relationships as a commodity. Whereas Casago saw it the other way around. They saw value in the relationships and then they saw the technology as a commodity. So it's easy to get lost with all these tools and all this AI and all these things that we can build. The goal of today's session is to invite you to focus on what truly drives enterprise value rather than getting lost in the noise of just adding more tools and just adding more inventory at all costs. Make sense? So what is enterprise value? How do we define enterprise value? So at a very high level, the way that there's different approaches to evaluating a company, but the most common one is EBITDA times a multiple, and we're going to break this down into, how do we, increase this. But basically, you all know what EBITDA is, and you all know what goes into it. I don't have to explain that. But let's break down, how to increase enterprise value, right? So if we know that enterprise value comes from EBITDA times the multiple, there's really a few levers we can pull here. We can increase revenue, we can decrease costs, and we can increase multiples, right? So we're gonna go one by one, and we're gonna be sharing some ideas and some thoughts that hopefully some of you guys can take home and apply right away. And the idea is that if you take one idea out of this and you apply it, this talk was a success. And if not, no refunds. So the first thing we can do is increase revenue by making owners worth more. So before you start thinking about adding more owners, what can we do to make the current owners worth more? Here's a bunch of ideas. Number one, incentivize long-term commitments. So who here has offered some kind of an incentive to your owners if they commit to a longer-term contract? A contract that is longer is worth more than a contract that they can cancel anytime. So something as simple as, you get 2 months free, you sign up for 12 months or for 24 months, and you can either decide to spread the 2 months free across, the term of the contract, or you can add it at the end, whatever you guys decide to do. Just incentivize long-term contracts, whether that's upfront or whether that's after an owner has been with you for a little while and you've earned that trust already. Just one idea. Add cancellation penalties to the contract. So if someone wants to cancel prior to, the end of the term, having a cancellation fee is going to make it worth more to a potential buyer. And something I should have said here earlier is that even if you're not thinking of selling your property management company anytime soon or never, just thinking about setting up your contracts and your operation and your business in a way where the business has some value is very, very relevant. There's a book, I actually had a 12-hour flight to get here because I was in Europe. I had 12 hours to try to prep for this as much as possible. And there was a book I had the time to read in 12 hours. Well, listen to actually. It's Built to Sell. Highly recommend it if anyone wants to learn more about what you can do to prepare your business for an exit. And it talks about the fact that even if you don't plan on exiting, it just allows you to have peace of mind and sleep well at night to know that your business is worth something should you want to make that move at some point. So the cancellation penalties to the contract. The other idea is, again, I'm not saying do all of this, I'm saying take one of these ideas and apply it. What about having a premium tier to your management program? Right? If some owners are requiring or requesting more hand-holding, right, and you normally charge 25%, and you're seeing that some of the owners are taking a lot of your time, why don't you offer a 30% program that's more premium, and all of a sudden that owner is worth more to you as well. And in the same way, if someone's wanting to cancel because they're wanting to go with a more, let's say, cheaper alternative, having a tier where maybe you don't offer certain services, certain elements, and you charge less, could be something worth considering as well. Another idea is to add fixed admin or tax on top of the variable commission. So a lot of people just charge a commission percentage and that's all, right? Adding a fixed fee in addition to that not only allows you to make sure that during low season you're still covering your costs, but it also makes it so that you have an extra source of revenue, which makes your current contracts worth more, ADIs of a potential buyer, and the fixed component to it is really attractive when a buyer is looking at you because it eliminates the risks and the volatility that comes with seasonality. Another one, this one may be a little tricky to implement, but if you do add a fixed fee, just the terms and conditions on how you charge that fixed fee can add extra revenue, right? If it's a monthly fee, but you charge every 28 days, those are the billing cycles, all of a sudden you may be 8% more annual revenue. That is this money that you get to add to your cost item. Charging an onboarding fee. A lot of times I see property managers doing the onboarding for free. They pay for the photography, they go and do the inspections. And some of those owners don't even end up onboarding and going through with the process at the end of the process, right? So just charging an amount or even putting a dollar amount to it, even if you're not gonna actually charge it, you can always decide to waive it in exchange for a longer term commitment. And then you can decide to say, well, listen, you're gonna pay the onboarding fee, $500, $1,000, whatever it might be. But if you decide to cancel before the 12-month term, then there's a cancellation penalty of the onboarding fee that I waived originally. So again, this is how you can kind of play around with some of these concepts. The other thing that can be played around with is to add a renewal fee. So what if you said, hey, every year, once an owner has been with you for a year, they're happy, right? It's unlikely they'll cancel. You can always decide to add a renewal fee. And depending on what your margins are as a property management company, this can be significantly more profits for you at the end of the year, and you can decide what you want this to be. Right? As I said, don't do all this. Think about, is there one thing here that you could see yourself implementing? So just raise your hand. Is there one idea here? There's many more that will come. Just want to know if this is relevant or not. Is there one idea here that any of you would see yourself considering in terms of implementing in your business? Only one person? A few of you? And those that didn't raise your hands, you don't like the idea of charging more to your owners? I guess it depends on the market as well. There's some markets that are very competitive, where you don't necessarily have the right, I guess, or the authority to do that. But that's where we're going to talk about other ways to, increase enterprise value. Other things, and now this is how we're going to tie this into smart pricing for a second, because it's what we do as a is revenue management as a service. A few other things that we can do to make owners worth more. Number one, do revenue management, proper advanced revenue management and listing optimization. And then, mandate pricing flexibility. So don't have contracts where the owner can set their own rates, right? When you put it in your contract that you're the one in charge of rates, that allows you to control the pricing and set it in a logical way rather than an emotional way. And then set minimum rates based on the cost structure of your properties rather than just based on feeling, right? And we're going to get into a few examples here. And this is really what it comes down to in terms of the logical versus the emotional way of pricing properties. And then we're going to show you how pricing properties logically versus emotionally can significantly increase the valuation of your property management company with a tangible example. So, this is just the example of the kind of owner that thinks more logically versus more emotionally. So the one that's more emotional will have more control but will make less income. The one that's more logical will have less control but will make more money. So it's just important for you guys to know which owners you have. And if you're okay with emotional owners, as long as you're charging a fixed fee in addition to it, then you might be covered, right? Because the problem with an owner that sets unrealistic minimum rates is that if you just charge a commission and you don't get bookings because the pricing is not competitive, then you're not making any revenue. Whereas at least if you're also charging the fixed fee on top of the variable, then you're compensating for those emotional owners that are not letting you be competitive. Now let's look at this as an example, which is actually a real example of what can happen when you set pricing emotionally versus logically. So when you look at these two, pricing graphs, ADR, the logical side, the emotional side, it's easy to say that the logical approach failed, right? Because it has a lower ADR. And that's how a lot of owners look at this. But the reality is that despite having grown lower in the lowest rate, because of that competitiveness, this particular property achieved a significantly higher occupancy rate, right? And therefore was able to generate more revenue. So let's keep these numbers in mind: 60,000 per property versus around 50,000 per property. And let's look at an example of what this can mean for a property management company in terms of its valuation. So remember, 60,000, 50,000. So let's look at how a 50 property management company can add 400,000 in enterprise value without signing any new owners, just by going from 50,000 to 60,000 a listing by having a competitive minimum rate, which will also get into how you should calculate those minimum rates. So what we can see here is an example where this is basically, this number here is 50,000 per property times 50 properties. Let's say that the revenue as a whole for the property management company is 40% of the bookings, so whatever 20 to 30% that you charge, plus any additional fees, add to a total 40% take home, right? So this business is making $1 million. Let's say there's some fixed costs to it and there's some variable costs to it. And then the EBITDA margin, let's say it's 20% of revenue. You're looking at, if it's a 3x EBITDA multiple, you're looking at 600,000 in valuation. By the way, I had a chat with Dylan from an M&A consulting firm that's out there as well. And he said that under $1 million in EBITDA, you're looking at anywhere between 3 to 5x EBITDA. Anything that is $1 million plus in EBITDA, you're starting to look at EBITDA multiples that are higher than 5, depending on the model. Now from there, we can see how a lift of 10% versus a lift of 20%. In the case of the 20% lift, that's the equivalent of going, once again, from 50,000 to 60,000 a listing. That's what we are seeing here in terms of the 20% lift. We're talking about 70% more in valuation, right? So it might not be a lot when you look at it at a per unit level, but when you look at it in terms of enterprise value, it's quite significant. And if you're looking at more than 1 million in EBITDA, and all of a sudden you don't have a 3x EBITDA multiple, but you have a 5x EBITDA multiple, it becomes even more significant. So this is why smart pricing and pricing flexibility, can make your business worth more. Make sense? Okay. Now, how to set minimum rates that maximize bookings? It's not based on what the owner wants. It's not based on what you see your neighbor do and be published at. It's based on the cost structure. So the first thing is defining the minimum rate. It is not the average daily rate, of course. It is not the ideal rate. It is not the rate you want to aim at during high season. Some owners hear a low rate and that's what they think of all of a sudden. What the minimum rate is the rate under which you would rather be empty, below which the owner loses money, right? So that's what you need to explain to your owners. And again, there's two ways to set this, right? You can set this emotionally. My property is worth X, less than this much. I don't want the kind of guests that come below this certain price point. And funny parenthesis on that note, we run an analysis on 13,000 reservations that resulted in 200 claims for property damage. And from those 200 claims for property damage, we try to see, is it true that the guests that paid more caused more damage? The guests that paid less caused more damage. And what we saw was the opposite. We saw that the guests that paid more caused more damage. So 65% of the claims for property damage have come in at price points that were below the property's ADR. So it just goes to say that it's not true that paying less necessarily means worse guests. And the other approach is logical, right? Logically is, what is the fixed cost of having a property empty? There's a fixed cost the owner has to pay, regardless of whether they're booked or not. What's the variable cost of getting an extra guest? And this is something that you can all calculate by simply adding up the fixed cost that the owner has to pay, and what's the cost of getting an extra booking, right? It's not rocket science. We also built a minimum rate calculator that's free, where you can do this exact same calculation and just input your variables or the variables from your owners, and it will tell you exactly where the break-even point is. And the insight I'm going to share here for a second is that even if you go below the break-even point, right, where you actually, are no longer making money, some fixed cost recovery is better than no fixed cost recovery. So basically, it's either, dear owner, you can pay for the fixed cost 100% out of pocket, or even if not covered fully by the guest, you can have the guest subsidize part of your fixed cost. Which would you prefer? Right, so that's how we recommend you look into this. Now, going back to what we were saying earlier, how to increase enterprise value, increasing revenue, right? These are just other ideas that we want to go through relatively fast. Of course, we talked about making your current owners work more. There's also adding more owners, and these are just some of the things that we see that not every property manager has. So just make sure you come up with some of this. Referral programs, testimonials, hiring salespeople, adding new revenue streams, affiliate partnerships. You don't have to deliver this, additional services yourself necessarily. You can partner up with local professionals, local vendors, whether that's furnishing providers, whatever that might be, chef providers, upselling things to your guests, damage waivers. All of those are things that you can do to simply increase your revenue streams. Okay? Now, let's talk about decreased costs, because if you remember that equation of enterprise value, right? EBITDA times multiple, and EBITDA, of course, there's revenue, right? And every dollar that we add in top line revenue, at best is maybe 20% profits, because if you have a 20% margin business, that's what it is. Versus every dollar that you save in costs, it goes straight to the bottom line. So it makes a lot of sense to also spend time thinking about how to decrease your costs. And these are some things you can look into and consider when it comes to decreasing costs. So the first thing is thinking about converting fixed costs into variable costs. So anything that's not core to the business, you can think about, is this something that I can hire for seasonally? If I have a cleaning staff or maintenance staff and they're leaving, right? I'm gonna hire someone new. Is it possible to come up with an arrangement where maybe you pay them a little bit more on a per hour basis, but they're not contracted throughout the year, they're contracted for the season, right? You can figure out how to go about it. Any cost that you can convert into variable as opposed to fixed when you're in the low season will have a significant impact on your profitability. Renegotiate often. All your vendors, even angels, not angels, but your other vendors, you can negotiate with often. And you'll be surprised, how much flexibility there can be if only you're consistent and persistent in making sure that you renegotiate all of your vendor agreements. Also, make sure that you let your vendors know that, they should value loyalty. I mean, we're surprised to hear people have their fees, technology fees, increase at the end of the term, as opposed to, rewarding them, right? So making sure that you let your vendors know that there are options. There are more options now than ever, right? So just being very diligent and having someone dedicated to just the process of always renegotiating your contracts can significantly have an impact on your bottom line. Push back the price hikes, we just discussed, and then it just helps as well to attack these things by categories. So just break down your expenses into categories. So what is employee costs versus technology costs and whatnot. And something else I forgot to mention on the revenue, ways to add extra revenue that I think is just worth mentioning in this point is the guest booking. It's very controversial, some people might like it, some people might not like it. But just adding a guest booking and essentially having that be another revenue source can be something that completely pays for your tech stack as well, right? And in reality, it's a fee that the owner absorbs. It gets discounted from what you report to them as revenue, just like you would discount the OTA fees. Most of the times when you report revenue to your owners, it's net of OTA fees or net of credit card processing fees. In the same way, you can have a guest booking fee, and this is also a way for you to add significant additional revenue that can cover the entirety of your tech costs. Now let's talk about ways to increase multiples. Right? We just discussed earlier that anything below 1 million in EBITDA is between 3 and 5 times EBITDA as a multiple. Anything more than 1 million in EBITDA, you can have multiples higher than 5 million. But there are other things as well that might make it so that you get a lower or a higher multiple in terms of someone valuating your company. And the first one is high autonomous operation. So needless to say, but if you have a business that depends on you as an owner, it's not a sellable business. it cannot be sellable. Right? If someone's going to buy it, there's going to be an earnout, and you're going to be needed. You're going to need to stick around for the next 3 to 5 years. Just because if you're the only person that the owner trusts, and someone wants to buy your business, well, how are they going to, let you go, right? The business is going to go with you. The owners are going to go with you, right? So something as simple as just thinking about hiring an owner relations person, hiring an account manager, even if you're not planning on selling the business, will first of all, allow you to, be more free and have a little bit of time to go on vacation and whatnot. But more importantly, allow your business to be sellable without the heavy earnout that could, keep you handcuffed to the business long after you decide to sell. Of course, there's also the idea of how do you incentivize your staff to stay post-exit, right? And sure, you hear a lot about stock options, and it's something that's very common in the world of technology companies, but it can also add complexity to a transaction, and it can also be expensive to set something like this up. So something as simple as a bonus that you put aside every year for your top management employees, your key employees, and you let them know that this is something that if you ever exit is going to be paid out to them over a period of 3 years, can add a lot of confidence to a potential buyer in knowing that when they buy you, not only are you not needed because the owners already have a point of contact that's not you on the relationship side, but also your employees are not just going to leave the moment they have a new employer, because they're incentivized by the sign to stay around, stick around. They want to see their bonus. Okay, so that's it. Of course, autonomous customer acquisition process. This is not always that big of an issue because a lot of times if it's a strategic buyer, they might already have owner acquisition figured out, and they don't necessarily want your acquisition efforts. But if you have a proper customer acquisition process that can increase the multiples that someone is willing to pay for you, so don't be required in that process. Right? Make sure that you have people other than the founder involved in selling and signing up new owners. Right? Because the moment you have this is the moment that you have an autonomous customer acquisition process. And ideally hire 2 salespeople at the same time. It's expensive, but you can also make it heavily commission-based so that you don't have to necessarily have a lot of fixed costs with it, and turning fixed costs into variable costs. Sales is a great way to do that since people like commissions. And why 2 salespeople at a time? To show that there's an actual repeatable process and it's not just one person. That was it. Also adding multiple acquisition channels, so if you can have referral partners, if you can have proper SEO, if you can have paid ad campaigns, if you can have your owners, you can actually offer the same referral bonus that you offer to your realtor. You can offer it to your owners if they refer business to you. And a very interesting hack on this note. Let's say you pay out $1,000 or $500, whatever you pay out per property to a realtor. You could say to the owner, hey, you have the choice. If you refer me another owner, I can give it to you as $500, or I can give you $500 worth of credit for our management services. You give $500 worth of value, but you're only paying your cost of delivering this service. So you're not actually paying $500. So it's a good arbitrage there that you can find in terms of this. Just multiple acquisition channels, etc., etc. Don't have one owner or one client, right, that represents more than 10 to 15% of your total revenue. And you can see that in cases where there's multi-property owners in the portfolio. That just adds a lot of risk to the business, and you just want to make sure that you have a very diversified customer base as much as possible. And here are other levers as well that you can pull in order to increase multiples. Growth rate, right? So are you growing consistently, both in terms of number of units, but as we discussed earlier, is more important to be growing revenue and profits on a consistent basis than necessarily it is to be just adding units. The revenue and gross profit per property, right? If you have solid gross profits per property, that can help increase multiples. Oak-Here review track record tonight, so if you're selling the business with a profile that has 10 years worth of history in terms of reviews, right? That can be something that's it's an intangible asset there that can add some value to the business as well. If you have a strong direct presence, it's something that can add some value as well. And then market share, right? Do you own the majority of the inventory in your market, or have you taken the approach of maybe being multiple, diversifying across multiple markets? Those are things that can have an impact as well when you're and preferential vendor contracts. If you have contracts with vendors that you've been able to negotiate over and over, year after year, where they reward your loyalty because of your persistence in asking for it, then that can be very interesting for a buyer, because they're gonna basically have a rate they would not have been able to get if they had just started this business from the ground up, because you have the discounts that you earn from your loyalty to your vendors over time. A few things that every property management company should look at, just to wrap this up, in order to level up your game as a property management company. I ask a lot of property managers, hey, where do your owners come from? And they don't know. So just having a CRM where you can know, hey, my owners come from this source, and these are my conversion rates, something that you're gonna keep track of. Conversion churn rate, this is super important, right? How many owners do you lose, right, a month, right? Out of your total portfolio size. And sometimes I ask this question to property managers, and they're like, oh, we don't lose any owners because they've all left just because they said they have to sell or whatever other reason. Well, those still count as properties you lost, even though it wasn't your fault. Sure, you can granularize it and break it down into preventable churn versus non-preventable churn, just to give yourself peace of mind that you're not doing something wrong. But it doesn't mean it's not churn, right? We need to understand what is the percentage of our total portfolio size that we are losing every month. From there, you're gonna have the average client lifetime in months. So how many months does an owner stay with you on average? And if you take your monthly churn, which we talked about earlier, and you simply take 1 divided by your monthly churn, it's gonna give you a number, which is the number of months that an owner stays with you on average. You don't wanna wait for 10 years to have passed by before you can say, oh, an owner stays with me on average 3 years. You can do this proactively on an ongoing basis by simply keeping track of your monthly churn. So every month you can say, oh, my average lifetime value is 10 months. Oh, my average lifetime value is now 15 months, based on how the churn evolves from 1 month to the next. From there, we want to look at, of course, what is the client lifetime value as well in terms of revenue, not just like duration, but revenue. So gross revenue that the property generates, times your commission, what you charge, times how many months, the owner stays on average, how many years, if you're looking at, gross revenues on a yearly basis, is gonna give your client lifetime value. So this is during the lifetime of an owner, what are the gross sales? What is the gross revenue that you earn from an owner during its duration, during its lifetime? So far, are we good? Yeah? Any questions on this? We continue. Now, once we have client lifetime value in terms of gross sales, we want to understand lifetime gross profit, right? Which is simply the client lifetime value that we calculated earlier minus the cost of delivering the service. Right? It's very important for you to know what's your cost of delivering the service, and it's very important for you to differentiate what is cost of delivery versus cost of growth. One thing that I see a lot of property managers misplace in terms of their cost is onboarding fees, onboarding costs. Let's say you have a team in charge of inspections, in charge of setting things up, all of those things. Those are growth costs. That goes into customer acquisition. That goes into sales and marketing, basically. Because if you were not growing and if you were not adding owners, you wouldn't need to have those onboarding costs. Making sure that you differentiate anything that's delivery from what is, customer acquisition, and of course from what is just general administrative expenses as well. So far so good. Gross profit per property. And then lastly here, if we multiply the gross profit per property, which is the revenue minus the costs, times the lifetime in months, this is where you get, lifetime gross profit. So the lifetime gross profit is a very important metric because it's from this metric that you will calculate how much you can afford to spend to acquire an owner. Remember we said earlier that one of the mistakes that Vacasa made is they didn't necessarily have a good understanding of how much they could afford to spend in order to acquire new owners. So this is where, knowing what that lifetime gross profit is will allow us to reverse engineer how much we should be willing to spend to acquire. How do we know CAC? So at the end of the day, these are the two most important numbers in any business. How much you pay to acquire customers and how much is that customer worth on average in gross profits during its lifetime. CAC to lifetime gross profit. If you understand those two numbers, you understand, whether you have a business that can be successful, right? How do you understand CAC? You just add up your yearly costs of sales and marketing, and you divide that by how many properties you added. That's the simple way of calculating your CAC. Right? Because it might go up or down from one month to the next, so you really want to look at it in the trailing 12 months, everything that's sales and marketing and onboarding, divided by how many properties you added during that period. And then lastly, the one I was talking about, CAC to lifetime gross profit, right? And we want to make sure that this number is at least 3x. So for every dollar that you spend in CAC, in customer acquisition costs, whether that's paid ads, whether that's SEO, whether that's referral, bonuses, whether that's salespeople, sales commissions, onboarding fees, for every dollar that you spend in CAC, you should be making at least 3 times that in lifetime gross profits. So that was it. Hope it was valuable, hope it was relevant, hope it was helpful. I'm going to open it up for some questions if there are any, but I just want to leave here this other gift that we're giving out is an IQ report that we call. Basically, one of our experts would look at one of your listings, give it a score of 100, and tell you exactly what we would improve if we were working with you to get more bookings, rank higher on the OTAs, and maximize sales. Hey, thank you all. Hope you enjoyed it.